Right. Today, what I'm trying to do is for my fifth years, the students that will be leaving and going out into that economy and that political system, um, what I want to do is to analyse not from the outside, externally, the systems and how they work, the political and legal and social and economic system, but in fact, um, give you a perspective from the inside, from my life, from what I lived through in terms of systemic uh, orientation and change. Okay, let's start. Go to Edward Heath's reign. So he was Prime Minister in 1970 to 1974. Edward Heath. He was on the right, and it was a country. So he came in to a country that was already, operating on a very, very left map. So on a kind of blueprint that was much further left than he would have liked. So he had to change. He had to change the country seriously uh, from from the roots, if you like. And he couldn't. He wasn't able to. In those days, we had very strong root unions, so we had lots of strikes. And when the miners went on strike with Edward Heath, they could just turn off the economy because they provided energy, and industry couldn't survive without it. Just stopped without energy. So the miners really, if they weren't happy, they could stop the economy. And they had a leader or leaders that were very, very politically left, and active politically left too. Scargill. So they obviously didn't like Edward Heath, him being of the right, and anything he did that was towards the right really ground on their nerves. And in those days, they didn't even need to ask the workers if they wanted to strike. They just call a strike. You didn't have to ballot the workers. And they had a strike. And there was a 3-day week too. So people were working just 3 days of the week. The other 2 days they were on strike. And during this time, my parents had left school. They hadn't done particularly well. They hadn't gone to, university and gotten some sparkling degrees. But they were very entrepreneurial, and my dad was an artist, really, deep down, and he got into antiques, buying and selling antiques, and he opened a shop, in fact. And my mum, she started a beauty clinic, a few beauty clinics, and they also bought apartments, had quite a few apartments. So they were doing all right. They were doing quite well. When I started school, I started in one of these elite paying schools, not a state school. But during these times, there was the inflation. And inflation was fed by the strikes, people demanding more wages. So, you get prices rising, so people ask for more wages because they've got all these strong unions, and then the price continues to rise, so that people continue to ask for more, and they never actually meet their objectives. They never actually get to a good standard of living because with the economic system. If you're not producing enough, you can't get paid more. They could have got maybe money from the directors, less profit, I suppose, but it seemed this was what was happening. So we had this wage price spiral. Also during this time, there were strong rent controls. So this meant that the law decided how much you paid for your rent. If you had a landlord, he couldn't ask you more than a maximum amount. And also the tenants were very protected anyway from landlords, so they couldn't be kicked out, and they didn't have to pay so much. But this was very hard on my parents, because obviously they had lots of properties and tenants in those properties, and if someone didn't pay because of this 3-day week, this miners' strike was seemingly reducing everybody's income, so some people couldn't pay, and there's nothing that they could do, my parents could do, but just take a hit. There was this famous Hoogstraten, who did really well out of the system, because he was from Brighton. He bought these properties quite often from people like my parents who couldn't get rid of someone and just decided to sell the flat. And he'd buy them very cheap, and then he'd get rid of them through very crooked means. And he'd gone to prison a couple of times. One for putting a bomb through the door of someone's flat because he wanted to get rid of them, and he used dastardly means and was a horrible man basically. And people like him did very well in the system. He became incredibly rich. Hoogstraten now is worth hundreds of millions. And that was all mainly through, crooked means, which seemed, the freeing the market. Later on, people like Hoogstraten did very well because there were no rules and they were able to do whatever they liked. In the 1970s, I do remember this kind of nanny state where you have the state who really looks after you. So you had all free dental treatment, all the school meals were free. They were not very nice. They were all very standardised, so everyone had the same thing. But it was all free. We even had free milk. We had inspectors coming to look in our hair for lice. Even people coming to look at our feet, strangely enough, just in case the toes were bent or something. And the schools, not in the private sector. The private sector, they were very strict, and it was quite severe of a system. But in the state schools, it was quite anti-competitive. So everything was geared towards helping the slower elements, and not much to helping those that were really intelligent and those who were really good. They weren't the teachers weren't that interested. A lot of teachers were from the left and really had an ideological cause. And I noticed, the difference a huge difference between the public sector and the private sector in education, massive. And always the private sector got the results. In terms of exams, they did incredibly well. And the state sector didn't, basically. If you look at the top universities in England, Oxford, for example, or Cambridge, it's all for the public school boys or girls. Public school, we mean private. The state schools are a very small proportion, which is a shame. But this was what I was born into. So strangely, we had this very left country where the government was big and it really helped the citizens and did everything for the citizens and really made sure they're protected. But at the same time, it had a kind of private education system where people could be ruthless and, be honest. If a kid's not doing well, you say he's not doing well, and those doing well, there's lots of resources to help them do even better. So I think, I could see the difference, the motivation, shall we say, to do better, which now in the schools, in present day, post-Thatcher, I could say yes, the schools are very competitive now and, do produce higher results, but at what cost? Because a lot of kids are left behind. A lot of schools don't want, only want kids that are very bright. So, we can think, what price did we pay for this? Higher results. And that's leaving a lot behind, I think. We must, which would be unacceptable for Italians. Right, so Winds of Discontent. This is some part of contemporary history for England, which is very, very symbolic, in which always the politicians, especially of the right, refer to, look back on, to warn against any left-wing governments coming into power. So it was a very difficult time. I remember this time well. This was a difficult time because basically everyone was going on strike. So we have the unions. This was during the Callaghan years. So this was a left-wing government. They'd taken over from the right, from the Heath government, and they'd basically tried to apply, a left-wing system, but people on the left weren't happy. So that you had these unions, these huge unions, with lots of power, lots and lots of members. Not like today. Many of the unions today have got very few members and very little power too. In those days, they had more power to go on strike. Now they've got to ballot them, etc. So, they brought the country to a standstill, basically. You've got the miners, again, can halt the economy anyway. But here we can see there's all these coffins because people weren't being buried. There was people on strike, the grave diggers were on strike, the rubbish people were on strike, and there was rubbish everywhere, and people weren't working. And this was what really brought the economy to its knees, this huge movement of the left, or the unions, to try to get more. from a system that was not doing well anyway. It wasn't producing much anyway. And in the end, the Great Britain had to go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to ask for a loan, which was quite humiliating because normally developed countries went there because we were unable to go forwards, basically. Now, this was the moment of this winter of discontent was the moment my parents had their difficulty. So they went bankrupt, basically. They found it very difficult. Remember, they'd left school with not much. They'd borrowed a lot to buy apartments, to rent out, bought businesses, built up businesses, spent a lot of money, and yet people weren't working. People were working, going on strike, just refusing to work, and many people didn't have money to pay for things, so the demand went right down, and businesses like my parents' business often went bankrupt, and it was a difficult time. I remember this time where this was the time when Mrs. Thatcher came into power to put the country right. She said basically to the country, this is not working, and we're going to have to get the country much less unionised and much more market oriented. So her big ideology was the free market and defeating unionism. So allowing businesses to work without the impediments of the unions wanting more money, etc. So when Mrs. Thatcher came into power, suddenly she brought down the public spending. There was a huge war on public spending. It had to become much less. For her, it was too much. And this led to a pretty miserable environment. I remember, because my parents had gone bankrupt, in the good times I'd be going around in taxis, and suddenly I was waiting at bus stops in dark rows in streets that the buildings seemed to be falling down. I've got a picture here of the West Pier, and here on the left we can see, in its glory days. And then if I move I can't move it. You can see the West Pier slowly falling down, and money wasn't spent to save it. There was a fire. In fact, there was a competition between the Palace Pier, another pier, and the West Pier, and they burnt the Palace Pier. It is suspected burned down the West Pier, and it ended up looking like the top corner. Now, this was quite symbolic of Thatcherism. The competition was intense, and anything that needed to be regenerated or rebuilt or recuperated had to justify itself as being worthy and able to be solvent and to make a profit. And the West Pier disappeared, if we can see in the top hand corner. And also I remember buildings falling down, streets very dark, graffiti spreading everywhere. We had this youth unemployment where there was masses of young people looking for jobs. I remember when I left school, originally when I left school, I didn't go to college, so I looked for a job. And some places you go to an interview, and there were 500 other kids in ties for that job. and it was just a waste of time, basically. And then we have the ascendancy of the punk era, because it was a kind of reaction to this lack of future of the young people. The young people were basically saying, that if you don't give us a future, why should we respect your social rules? They no longer wanted us to respect. Made their hair crazy colours and spiky, and put chains everywhere, and on the stage in the concerts they'd spit at the band, and the band would spit back, and the singer would vomit, and they just anything to break the social rules. And this was basically a statement saying, there's no future for us young people, so we're not going to respect your social niceties. And for the English, the social niceties and being polite was everything. So, it was quite a clever, if not unconscious move of the younger generations. The first bands, one of the first bands, the most famous, was the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious. And if you look at him and the way they behaved, you could understand these were just not trying not to be part of society as possible. That was the objective. So then Thatcher's rise to power. So Thatcher was a daughter of a shopkeeper, which says everything. She was all about being prudent with money, being individually responsible and careful, and careful of the costs, and looking for opportunities. And so she believed in this shopkeeper mentality for the whole of Britain. Britain was to be a PLC, public limited company, and everyone was to think of their, good shopkeeping, if you like, and to behave prudently and look for opportunities and be hard work. So yeah, she believed in hard work and the entrepreneur. So the individual looking for opportunities to build some sort of activity. She was very fiscal responsible, so she believed, you must not have your costs greater than your income. Otherwise, that's the road to ruin, if you like. So we must be fiscally responsible. We must keep the public accounts, the public spending down, and then try to maximise the income and the profit, the GDP, so the government can spend. She's very pro-market, so she believed in a very small government, and anti-union. Remember, you can't be very, very pro-market and liberal if you believe strongly in unionism, because it goes against the market forces. And she was anti-public services, so anything that could be private should be. She believed strongly that the private services are, or any service is best in the private's hands, and that they should be as little public service as possible. In fact, she said, one of the famous things she said, there is no such thing as society. We are all individuals. So what is, she would say, what is this society? What is it? It doesn't exist. We're individuals. We don't really exist as a society. So we need to think as individuals. Or another example of her controversial sayings was, unemployment is a price worth paying. She believed firmly that having people unemployed meant that it's a good thing, because if you've got everybody employed, then there's no expansion for the economy. Firstly, it's just going to be inflation. Any more money would just go into inflation, and also it keeps the costs down by having lots of unemployed people. Won't be wanting more money, and that having unemployed people as a factor of production, as a reserve, not thinking about them as people, but thinking about them as a factors of production, having them as a reserve is worth having, because if an opportunity comes up for the economy, there's people there to employ and take that opportunity. Right. So just to think a bit more about her ideology, her way of thinking. She was a big fan of Adam Smith, if you like, which was all about the free market and how it works, and how it works best without any intervention. Adam Smith said individual ambition serves the common good. So we all try to do the best for ourselves, and by doing the best for ourselves, it does the best for everybody. So if somebody works hard and maybe they open a shop and it's very profitable, and that shop pays taxes, and it does a good service, it employs people, and those taxes can pay for pensions, etc. So that individual ambition, that building that shop, has also done a lot of good for other people. So that was her philosophy. Let's get the individuals thinking of themselves and working hard to make, as a market, to make production maximise and most profitable and innovative. And that will do us all good. That was the way she looked at things. So she was very focused on the individual and the private, not the public. Now, John Nash, he said, if we go back to the Beautiful Mind film, he worked out his game theory that it's quite incomplete, this idea of individual ambition serves the common good, because actually it doesn't produce the best result. The best result will come if we think of ourselves, yes, but also of the group. So we're not just thinking of ourselves, but also the group, what's good for the group. And that's his game theory. And that is actually the European Union mentality. So this solidarity, this value for solidarity brings the best result. You need the free market. You need people to think of their own needs, because if it's just the government thinking of taking care of everybody, you're not going to get the best result. You'll get the communist planned economy. But if we do have a free economy, but also think of the interests of the society, that is the best result. So with the English free market, it's very different than the European Union social market, which is a bit more John Nash, if you like. So right. So yes, when my parents went bankrupt, I was able to get, like I think I mentioned, that in England it's very easy to get a loan. If you go to a bank, in Italy it's quite difficult. You've got to have a lot of security. They want, that you've got a certain property or assets to secure that loan. Whereas in England, it's probably easier for them if you don't pay them back to get that money back, to take you to court. The courts work easier, and so they're a bit more prepared to lend you money. And when my parents went bankrupt, they went into a popular housing, and I decided, I was very young at that time, I decided to buy a boat and live with friends. It was very cheap, and we've got the actual boat here in the corner, in the lower corner. And it was just as I was going to college, towards coming up to when I was going to university, when I bought that boat. We lived there. There was enough room for 4 of us, had a coal fire, very uncomfortable in the winter because it rained and drops would come in. You'd have to have tins everywhere catching the drops. And in the summer you'd have to paint it to keep the water out anyway. And there you can see the tides down, but it came up and it managed to float. And Mrs. Thatcher's privatisation, this great movement towards privatising the economy, even touched my boat. So this happened because the moorings were public. So I bought the boat very cheap, 10,000 quid at the time, which is incredibly cheap. Property at that time to live in for 4 people would cost you 150,000 at least. So I bought it for 10,000, very cheap. But the moorings were public and they had to be paid yearly. The moorings were the kind of tax to be like a car tax on the road. You needed a boat tax to be on the water. But these moorings became private. They became privatised. So we bought them, and we bought them very cheaply. Thatcher always tried to sell things cheaply, so whoever bought them would make a lot of money, and then she'd get another vote. When she sold the council houses, the Casa Popolare, she sold them very cheap, and then all the thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people that bought them that normally would vote Labour voted Tory. It was a good example of a bit of an electioneering as well. So we bought them, and the boat tripled in price. Suddenly, it was worth 30,000, and these days it's worth a fortune because you have the freehold, which means you actually own the land it's on. It's no longer part of the public land. So that's an idea. And there's other examples when I took advantage of this Thatcher revolution, which was good for some people. If you were quick and you had a bit of money and a bit of intelligence, it was good. But for many, it wasn't, and it left people behind. So in 1986, I was still living on my boats with my friends, and I decided to leave college just before the exams, which was unfortunate because of money. I was at the time working as a shelf filler while I was at college, 20 hours a week. It used to be 6 to 10 o'clock in the evening. Just filling up shelves for Tesco's, in fact. I had a motorbike, a little one, that I had to maintain, and then I had to maintain myself. My parents could help a little bit, but not much. And I just found it so difficult with the loan and everything to make ends meet. And I just got tempted, I suppose, to see, if I could go out there and start relaxing with a bit of money in my pocket. So I became an insurance clerk. First of all, my friend went to Greece. He left before his exams, and he left to just wander around Europe doing little jobs around Europe, and he ended up in Greece for some reason. Bit of a hippie lifestyle, but That's what tempted me, I think. Once he'd gone, I thought, well, why don't I try? And I suppose you do need to experiment in those when you're that young. You really need to go and find what you want. You don't have the experience, yet you're making big decisions. So maybe it was a good idea just to try it and then go back to college. So I became a clerk, an insurance clerk for Legal and General in Hove for 3 years. Basically, I was sales support staff, which was there to help a salesman, and really the people getting rich were the salesmen. We had millionaires, salesmen that become millionaires because they'd made all the contacts and they'd managed to build up a network, and we were there just to support them and just to get. Now, they'd have a computer, tiny little laptop. But in those days, they had a team of us supporting them, and we were basically just pushing paper around, and it was very automatic and not very creative. And glad I got out of it. So I did decide to get out of that because, you were paid a reasonable wage, but there was no future, really. If you were a bit bright, you could see that it wasn't going to go anywhere. They weren't really developing you, and you have to make these judgments. Very important. Some people I know, people that are still there, not doing the same job, but they're still there, and they're not really that far down the road from when I was there. So very good decision, I thought, for myself to leave and just to become self-employed as a courier, a motorbike courier. This was kind of joining the Thatcher Revolution, because the Thatcher Revolution, people were becoming self-employed, freelance, and earning astronomical amounts of money. Suddenly, you're your own boss. If you didn't want to go into work that day or that morning, you wouldn't. And you became your own boss, and it was very tempting. And it's a lot of money because it was tempting people out of the normal conventional model, which was to drive a van and deliver things for the post office, where you got paid just as a wage, because only the post office could deliver things. But with the Thatcher Revolution, slowly you get more and more couriers delivering things, smaller and smaller parcels being able to be delivered that weren't the monopoly of the post office. And so you have these courier services popping up, offering super fast delivery and super secure delivery with a motorcyclist. And the astronomical amounts of money was to really try to tempt people out of a normal secure job into a life where you're your own boss. And what I could do was I could take 4 things from Brighton to London and deliver them at 4 different addresses and get paid 4 times, or maybe even take something to London and something to Scotland and something to Wales, and I'd get paid for them all. So they were called double ups. You might still be worth going to London just for one thing, but not much. But if you could take more, because there are more going to the nearby place, then you could earn a lot of money. And I did, basically. It was a dangerous job, especially driving in London on a motorbike. But I was earning about £1,000 a week, sometimes, not often. Doing ridiculous amounts of hours, astronomical amounts of hours, totally over any regulation would, limit. But I don't think there were any regulations for motorcyclists. We just used to work until we dropped. And, £1,000, and this was, you're talking 25 years ago, earning that sort of money was incredible. And it wouldn't have taken me that long to save up and buy a house. So this was the Thatcher Revolution, where people were taking the risk of, losing work and not making a profit and maybe having a crash and not, having to pay for it yourself, but also profiting. Often with this self-employment, it became very simple. You just started. You didn't have to fill out any paperwork. At the end of the year, you'd have to fill out a tax form, and you'd have 3 lines. You'd have your income, your costs, and then calculate your profit. And then you pay 20% on that. So it was very easy, and many people just didn't even bother paying 20% on that, because Mrs. Thatcher was totally against collecting tax, and she put no money into the service, and there were no inspections, and I knew people that didn't pay tax and never had any problems for 10 years. They never got investigated. So in that kind of culture of being totally free market, it was kind of a good thing not to pay tax, and it wasn't seen as that wrong. A little bit like now, you go to a lesson, pay a private tutor €20 for a lesson, an hour study, and there's no tax paid. It was considered normal. No one paid any attention. So people were earning astronomical amounts of money and not paying any tax. And then, I could save some money, and I had a bit of a big decision to make, whether I continued and tried to keep, to go and buy a house and maybe start a business. I had some ideas about importing from Thailand, or to go back to university. Now, I did start a business importing from Thailand because I knew my friend Fogg had gone over and lived there with his girlfriend, and he started sending things over which he thought could be marketable, because in those days, that was when it really began, the initial importing from China or Vietnam or all these, Bangladesh, all these places in the East, where it was just taking off, and the first things he sent over were terrible. I remember one thing as hanging on my wall, but it was awful. But and there's other. He sent saffron. I remember him sending stacks of saffron over, which is really expensive as an ingredient, as a spice. But you can't do anything with it if it's in a big quantity, because you have to go round, and it's actually the logistics that make it so expensive, not the cost of it. So he thought, this is worth a lot, but actually walking around restaurants, you don't sell it easily. You have to walk around hotels and restaurants and sell it in tiny quantities. So there was a lot of experimentation, but we did find silver jewellery, which was marketable, and I did make contacts with local shops. I did start a market stall in Brighton, and I did have some regular customers that normally would go to London for similar. There was one place that was just did this silver jewellery, and she normally had to go drive her van to London and buy it from a warehouse in London. So for her it was great. I could just turn up with the stuff and she'd give me the money. And the question of this being, there wasn't a question of it being, it was a question of just making contacts, me going out, finding contacts around London, North London. As soon as you make a contact and they start a relation and ordering from you, you just continue. You keep continuing, and you get bigger and bigger. You know, one person maybe doesn't take much. The first part of introducing yourself is where the work is, and then after that, it could go on for years. They just fill out a form and you send them what they want, and they send you the money, etc. But it was at this point I realised I didn't want, because I had a big breakup with my girlfriend at the time, and that was a moment of transformation. I think then I realised I wasn't interested in making money and spending hours and hours on the road, meeting people all over, you know, London, and just to make money. And I thought, no, this is for some people, it's not for me. And I thought, well, what can I do? I studied economics, a bit of law, commercial law. I thought, well, I'll go back to college, continue, and get habilitated as an economics teacher. So I'd done economics in college, so it was quite good. And I started as just an economics degree, which had a lot of law in it as well. It had commercial law, it had European law. So this was also perfect timing, actually, because now, at that time, the economy was going down. It was tanking. There was a big crisis coming. It was a famous moment of John Major, the Prime Minister, had pulled out of the exchange rate mechanism, because we were to go into the European currency, and there was Soros, the famous speculator, was literally selling as much pounds as he thought he could, because he knew, and he was buying and selling, he knew that it was overpriced and that the Brits had to keep it at that high price because of this exchange rate mechanism, because they were going into a single currency, so they had to maintain the level with the other currencies. So the Bank of England would have to keep buying it even if it's not worth that much. And he made about 10 billion out of the English before they actually pulled out of this mechanism. And this really not just cost us 10 billion, but also the confidence of the business community, and a big crisis started because people weren't confident that things would get good. They saw the mess John Major made, and they thought, you know, that we haven't got the confidence, so we're not going to invest, we're not going to buy the new house, we're not going to expand the business, except take on new people, because we will wait and see what happens, because the economy was starting to go down, and then it just kept going down. And being a courier, you're kind of on the front line of the economy. When things go down in the economy, the couriers feel it immediately, because we're delivering for everyone. We're kind of the logistics for all. You know, we were working for factories, delivering parts for production lines, or airplane parts, or medical parts, or going and getting people's passports from the embassy, standing in line. I remember having to go to the Russian embassy and queuing up and waiting in line with a delegate, with a delegation from someone because they wanted their passport. And being a courier, they just said, well, we're paid to do that, go there, stand there and come back. And we did lots of things, but suddenly not much was happening in the couriering. Logistics is a very good barometer of the economy. So it's a good time to go back to university, go back to education, and stop couriering while the other couriers were suffering with reduced work and just sitting around all day, chatting. I'd gone back to university, and many couriers did actually do university and PhDs and masters during the bad parts of the winter. A lot of them reduced. In the summer there was lots of couriers. In the winter suddenly not many people were around because a lot of the couriers that had made money were, at university. Normally in England it's free and it's paid for by the government. Couriers are a strange bunch in England because we do a dangerous and not highly habilitated job, but we are. The motorbike couriers are normally very high intellectual level because a lot of them spend their lives going in and out of university studying this and that. So, but this was just right for me. Okay. Right, so it wasn't just me joining the Thatcher Revolution or being influenced by it. Also my parents were, making these decisions to take advantage of this new orientation, political orientation of privatisation and etc. So they were slowly getting back on their feet. Remember, they'd gone bankrupt, and they'd managed to buy their council flat cheap from the government after a few years. So these flats were, casa popolari, and they were sold cheaply to the tenants, which was great for this privatised the property, and it was great for the tenant because they always bought them cheap, but it meant that property wasn't available to someone else that needed it. If I'd got back on my feet and maybe I could go and find another place to live, buy my own place, that someone else could come and rent that if they needed, if they were in the position of, also being bankrupt or destitute or whatever. My father was also starting an economic activity. He was sending damaged paintings to China. So before, he was always an artist, and he had repaired them. He was a restorer of antiques and paintings by profession. But by sending to China these paintings, they would do it perfectly for very little money. And then he could sell the paintings. So he could do this in quite a quantity to scale, shall we say. So he could do quite a few of them and started to make a lot of money doing that. And this was something, an opportunity he'd seen in the paper that was being advertised. There was lots of opportunities of businesses and activities being sold as a kind of package, a franchise or something like that. And he bought into this. So he got the contacts, the Chinese contacts, etc. He paid about 3,000 quid, and then suddenly he had a good way of making a living. And my mother did a course on counselling and became a freelance counsellor, which was also, part of the revolution. In the Thatcher Revolution, we were finding people moving around a lot to try and find opportunities, especially from the north. They'd come to the south, so they didn't have their parents or their grandparents to talk to, and they'd get a counsellor to talk to let things out, and she'd be paid to be a grandma, if you like. So they didn't really, solve deep psychological problems, but they'd be there to kind of reflect on and worked with people at maybe there's a head office in Brighton for American Express, and many of the workers had come down from the north, and maybe they didn't need a counsellor working in American Express to help people, share things and be able to feel a bit more comfortable. Again, she was self-employed and making lots of money. So there were people looking for these opportunities to take the risk and make the money. This was the Thatcher Revolution. Thatcher was all about taking a risk and looking for opportunities and taking the responsibility, not just being paid by somebody and then you just do as you're told, but actually becoming a kind of wealth producer and working under your own steam and being master of your own destiny. But this wasn't all roses, so it seemed quite good for us at the time. Later it could be questioned, but it also was very difficult for the emerging underclass. Before this, there was, the working class, the middle classes, the upper classes. Now we started to see an underclass, which, popped up in the form of people, just big areas of South London, where they got gang wars and they just stood around on the streets taking drugs, homelessness, people that really couldn't make it, that weren't able to just do a course or find an opportunity or invest a little bit to find a way, a road. And there was, millions of people in the underclass that ended up generations without work and just drug addicts and just really left behind totally. So it wasn't always positive. Remember, the government was selling a lot of the resources and there wasn't the help for this underclass. Before, anyone that really needed help, there was always help. There was always a way. The government, the state would be close to take care, the nanny state, as they called them. But now, people were insisting low tax. It was to be a low tax economy, so, to encourage people to be entrepreneurial and keep what they made. And so there weren't the resources, and many of the houses had been sold that, they could have had, the homeless could have had, etc. So it was a difficult time for many people. And even, I would say, looking back in reflection, even the people that were doing well did tend to start thinking solely of work and making money and neglecting families and relationships. We find people moving away a lot. Suddenly, nobody's got much time for each other because they're, trying to get to the big time, if you like. During this period, we have these icons of the revolution. We've got Loads of Money, which was played by Harry Enfield. He was a character that was imitating the quite uneducated builder type that had loads of money, had lots and lots of money, because if you were a bricklayer and suddenly there's lots of bricklayers needed, then you can say, well, I want 1,000 a week to be a bricklayer, and you get it. So you found these quite uneducated, not that highly trained people earning lots of money and going a bit off the rails, if you like. During the lesson we can watch some of these videos. And then you've got the yuppies. The yuppies are the young and up and coming big earners. Normally they started being called yuppies, those that worked in the city, brokers that were buying and selling shares and bonds, etc. They were making so much money. They were like big parts of London, just all of it was full of Porsches, and these very young people were going a bit off the rails too. There's been a few films about these types, like Wall Street, where they start seeing a lot of drugs and things. They weren't associated with the yuppies, the drugs, but excess was. So those, I would say, are the big iconic characters of the Thatcher Revolution, the yuppies and the loads of money and the underclass. So it produced these types. Right, so other icons of the Thatcher Revolution, I think the big bang of the stock market was quite an icon. That was a moment when the stock market became very deregulated and opened up to foreign investments, and basically it meant that you didn't have to pay an initial quite high amount to trade, so anyone could trade on the stock market. I, in fact, had a bit of a play on the stock market. I remember investing in Stagecoach buses, which were run by the well-known Richard Branson, the Virgin guy, entrepreneur, and it did very well, because basically in those days everything seemed to do very well, and I knew lots of people investing on the stock market, and prices were going up and up, and the brokers themselves had become self-employed. They were no longer working for firms and were earning commission and making astronomical amounts of money themselves. And this was also a period, the Big Bang was a period when they stopped shouting prices to try and sell stock and started using screens to communicate prices of stocks and what's available and how much they cost, etc. So there was this computerization of it too. So there was this deregulation, which at the time did very well, but also there were questions later whether this contributed to the 2007 recession. Remember, in that recession, the deregulation of the housing market in America, where they were just lending money to anyone, whoever, without any deposit or anything, to buy a house. Eventually, the prices went up and up and up, and eventually the housing bubble burst, and the prices came shooting down, and even Lehman's Bank went bankrupt. And the government had to save other banks and save General Motors even. So the Big Bang and deregulation could have been a factoring of the worsening of this crisis for Britain. But at the time, it was a stimulation to trade, and really added to the exchange of shares and bonds. So that was another interesting icon, I should say, would be mass unemployment, because before, I don't remember before Thatcher having mass unemployment or having even employment problems, particularly in England. But mass unemployment really started in England, apart from, we're not talking about the Great Depression, I'm talking about after that. It started with Thatcher. And she herself said unemployment is a price worth paying, and unemployment really has been a problem since Thatcher, never really gone down seriously to a rate where it's irrelevant. You know, if we're talking about frictional unemployment, where just people changing jobs and maybe they're a month or something unemployed, it's not a problem. But really, we haven't really got down that low, so it's just frictional unemployment since before Thatcher. So I would say that was quite an icon. And homelessness, again, homelessness pre-Thatcher didn't happen in my memory. I remember seeing some tramps, people famously not wanting to live amongst society, but I never saw anyone sleeping in the street until there was Thatcher, and then they seemed to spring up like mushrooms, and lots and lots of people slept in the streets from then on. I've chosen these pictures actually because the homeless people themselves were even made entrepreneurial, if you like, with this magazine, The Big Issue. So we've got on the bottom corner on the left a magazine, The Big Issue. This is a homeless woman trying to sell it, and only the homeless could sell this. So instead of begging, they'd sell this, and this would be full of things that were interesting and you know, of a certain orientation politically, maybe, that were you know, was to help the poor and the vulnerable. And they'd wear this coat, that red coat she's got on, to show they're officially recognised as a Big Issue seller, and she, you know, she'd have to prove she's homeless, and she'd be able to make a bit of money through that. So even the homeless joined the Thatcher Revolution in a way. There's another photo in the middle. Says, make Thatcher redundant, not the working class. At the beginning, Thatcher was seen as kind of an enemy of the working class, an attack on the working class. But many of the working class actually bought into her revolution and bought their council houses or became self-employed and quite rich. So she managed to divide us. Many of them left their unions, didn't bother anymore with their unions, which she was so anti. And so I think towards the end, a lot of working class people, which we consider workers, that, you know, not particularly that highly educated, but want to just work for a living, like a postman or something. You know, they initially they didn't like her, and in the end, some of them were very pro-Thatcherism. The successful ones, I would say, but many were left behind too. like that homeless woman, so they were working class and they were just left behind, and then you got the successes, and then I don't know. Trainspotting, this was an interesting film. This was a bit about the underclass, and it was by a heroin addict. So it was about a group of guys that were heroin addicts, and they had problems. And it was a comedy. It was a kind of black comedy. But you had to live Thatcherism to really understand. Because my Italian wife, never really found it funny. She thought it was very sad. But me and my friends, we found it funny. Because it was a kind of laughing of the desperation. Okay, so a key to the Thatcher philosophy was individualism and self-employment and personal responsibility. So for her, the unions and solidarity and these kind of group interests, collective interests, were wrong, basically not morally correct. And she immediately rolled her sleeves up and went to work to beat the unions. Remember, the unions originally were the ones that had brought down Edward Heath with the 3-day week and the miners' strike. The miners could halt the whole economy, and so if they weren't defeated, they could stop a right-wing government, a small state government. In these coal mining towns, often the only thing which was public, which was private, was the beer, the bars serving the beer. Everything was public, so they really lived in a world of public services and solidarity and collective interest. And so her first thing was to close, to stop the miners, because they were the most powerful, and they could bring down the government with their strike. So basically she organised a battle with the miners by not giving them what they want, and then they went on strike, and she'd already prepared lots of reserves of coal, so there was enough coal for Britain to keep going, and so you didn't have a winter of discontent. And then she organised for miners, labour, to come in to break the strike, and she tried to encourage strike breaking and organise an army of police officers to stop the strikers getting what they wanted, which was to make picket lines and stop people working. And eventually she broke the miners' strike. And after that, she was able to stop, make it illegal to have picket lines by workers that are from different plants, different parts of the country, and make it a requirement that they have to have a ballot of an absolute majority to go on strike. So they needed a ballot and need to get an absolute majority. And any damage done when these requirements weren't respected, any damage done would be, the unions would be held responsible and have to pay damages, have to pay compensation to the companies. So she broke the unions. She also broke the closed shops, which means that, you know, if you join an industry, you have to join the union. It's a requirement, and that's a closed shop. And she made that illegal, etc. This was the moment of reorientation of Britain towards this private ownership and self-employment, and away from the collective public mentality. It was also a very painful time for the miners because, yes, their pits were being closed and not replaced with any opportunities. In Italy, it couldn't happen. You know, you can't just close and throw hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people out of a job and close all the communities in the process without coming up with some sort of industrial plan to replace work and opportunities for the next generation. Because what happened in effect was you ended up with completely dead villages and towns and cities where there was no money and no activity going on. So I think, you know, the ruthlessness of Thatcherism really showed up on this particular strategy in terms of, you know, in Italy maybe they wouldn't close the mines, they'd just not employ new people, all the while trying to organise and encourage and stimulate new industry and alternative means of employment. In England, they just crushed the miners, and that was that. Okay, so looking at Thatcherism, this revolution in a big way, the base of it was privatisation, you know, turning everything into private ownership and then profit, and then having a low tax system. So to encourage this expansion and innovation and hard work to produce, it was really, low regulation, low tax, small state, and really trying to encourage people, even just workers to own something, maybe become self-employed, or buy a van and become a van driver, and be freelance basically. So privatisation really went through our whole system. We've got energy, telephone, buses, trains, rubbish collection, school catering, logistics, cleaning, even water. So, but the big services like energy and telephone, they were floated on the stock market, and people, including me, bought them because they were very cheap. They always went up in value. So you always made a lot of money. If you bought 10,000, you might be able to make 5,000 in a day. If you had a lot more, you could make a lot more. And then there was like the rubbish collection, which was just given a contract, given to local companies. Or not even local company. We had rubbish collection in Brighton operated by a Spanish company, but they were private companies doing it. They'd have to win the contract as school catering, logistics. Before Thatcher, all the councils had vans to take things around, and suddenly they didn't have any vans, and people would be working for them, even on an individual basis, just taking things around freelance, cleaning, and that was done given to private companies. Even secretarial work, the councils got less and less administration, and just gave it to secretarial agencies. So there was this massive movement towards private, and people earned a fortune. And this really taught people about, the market and ownership of means of production and making a profit. And it drilled into their heads this enterprise model, and people started to think in terms of, Great Britain PLC, a public limited company, not as a country and a society, but actually as a business. People started thinking of us as a business rather than a country. You even got council tenants buying their houses very, very cheap. My parents did, and making a lot of money like that, and then renting them out. Building societies, those were like banks, but they weren't private. They were kind of mutual cooperatives, and they floated on the stock market. So, I went round many building societies just to open an account, just because if they floated and went private, I would be given literally a couple of £1,000 worth of shares. And I made a lot of money like that. Lots of people did. And share ownership became fashionable after this great movement towards the private. People started buying and selling shares to kind of bet or make money. If you wanted to bet, you'd buy the penny shares of small companies and just bet whether they'll last and grow or whether they go bankrupt, or you could buy a big company instead. Yeah, so one of the most important aspects of Thatcherism was to encourage people to become self-employed, to become their own boss, and then assume the risk and the responsibility of, success. And if they do well, then they make a lot of money. If they don't, then they lose whatever assets they had to produce. So we see this self-employment. We've got builders. Builders used to work for big companies, big firms, and then suddenly they're all getting self-employed. There's no more contracts between the worker and a boss. It's the builders going straight to the customer and offering their services, and so they slowly all started behaving like businesses. Many builders slowly over time employed other builders and bought a van and got a little gang of builders together, and then they could really, behave like a private enterprise and not just be self-employed. This made big projects quite difficult because, big projects, you do need big organisation. You can't have lots and lots of little builders coming and saying, "Oh, I'll do something." To build a big block of flats, you need a big company to organise. So there was a little bit of a problem, I think, in England when it came to construction of big projects. You look at China, they're building whole cities in 3 months, whereas England would find it very difficult because we're also disintegrated to small, fragmented markets, not big producers, but lots and lots of small producers. But anyway, you've got the drivers. Suddenly everybody was becoming self-employed as a driver. They're buying their own vans and delivering whatever packages or whatever's needed. Salesmen all became self-employed and operated under commission. Lawyers, medical services, cleaners, reporters, photographers. We've got this huge movement that made self-employment worth doing because it suddenly became very deregulated, and also it became very easy to avoid tax because basically Thatcher never put much resources into the tax collection services, and in the end they had to just use the resources they had on collecting taxes from big companies. Otherwise they wouldn't be able to collect much. So there's so many people avoiding their tax in England, it became, as small entrepreneurs, it became quite the norm. In Italy, it's quite the norm to avoid taxes on transactions with property because nobody values their property properly. If you buy and sell a property, you always say it's worth 50,000 instead of 150,000, and that's become the norm. That's become considered quite legitimate. But in England, it became quite legitimate to avoid your tax if you're a small guy and self-employed. People pay something, but it never got investigated. So, things weren't very honest in this revolution. And we see that also with the politicians. A lot of the politicians were prosecuted, and many went to prison for sleaze, for doing things, receiving payments for companies, and joining the Thatcher Revolution on the darker side. Okay, in 1993, I started importing from Thailand. So, there's a bit of an opportunity came my way, and being part of this Thatcher revolution, I decided, my friend who had gone to Greece when I was at college was living in Thailand with his girlfriend, and they were sending me products to see if I could market them. This really was the time when these eastern places were starting to produce for the more developed economies, China especially. Now a lot of the productions moved towards Bangkok and Vietnam and places like that. But during the 80s, late 80s, it was just starting out in these other places like Thailand, and my friend said there were so many people going to these factories and just buying, the Americans and Canadians and all these different nationalities, buying stacks of things and sending them to sell in their home country. So he wanted to see if he could find products, and we did go through a lot of products that were totally inappropriate, bags and rugs and saffron. Saffron was one because he could get it very cheap in Thailand. It's a herb you use with cooking, And here it's very expensive, but the big problem was you only use a tiny amount. And so he sent me huge bags of saffron, which were worth enormous amount, but the best I could do was take them to hotels and restaurants and sell them in tiny packets for €5. And it just, the money just wasn't worth the logistics. The money really came from having to take them around in small and sell them in small amounts. So he sent me lots of possibilities, and the only thing we found that was a real possibility was this silver from Thailand. And I've got some pictures there. It's just jewellery, but it's proper silver jewellery, quite cheap. And there was already a lot of the stuff, not a lot, but some of the stuff in Brighton. And so I started taking this jewellery, which was quite good because it wasn't too big and difficult to store. And going round the shops, making contact, and started to become a wholesaler to a shop, a travelling salesman, if you like. And then even to go to London and travel to London. Because once you made a contact, the great thing is they reapply. And a lot of these contacts had already got their jewellery from London, but they didn't want to bother to go all the way to London. They preferred me to come along and pay me the same price, but I deliver it, rather than wasting a day in London going to a big warehouse full of the stuff. So this was the start of big possibilities. Now, if you see some of the people who had started early 90s, they're huge. Some of these companies importing, they're still importing, but they're just massive companies worth multi-million pounds of capital invested in them. And that was a real possibility. The question was, just going around making contacts, because the products were already of quite a big demand. But so my part was to build a network of shops, and my friend had the role of building a network of suppliers and organising the transportation. But during this period, I broke up with my girlfriend, and I decided that going around shops in London and around London and making contacts all day, every day, was not for me. I wanted something a bit less, a bit more communal. So I decided to stop and to go back to university and to get a degree in economics and European law. And the idea was to do a 2-year law degree after this, to become a lawyer. My friend had done the same. He'd got a degree and then he became a medical lawyer, because he got his degree in medicine, and he did a 2 years top up to get a law degree so he could specialise in medical law. Mine was to specialise in business law. So I started this university degree with that intention. And as life is life, it didn't go in that direction. I did manage to do well at the university, but I met my future wife, who was Italian. And I realised, after travelling to and from Italy and seeing the beauty of Italy and the lifestyle, I realised that actually my destiny would be much better to go in that direction. So this idea of becoming a lawyer changed. And my new idea was to teach English, but also economics. So that the real objective was to teach economics, which would be difficult in Italy because economics normally is an Italian teacher that's done an Italian concorso, but I wasn't Italian. I had to first master the language, never mind about do a concorso in Italian. So in 1996, my first step in this direction was just to learn the language and to keep travelling to and from Italy to see my girlfriend, my Italian girlfriend. So right, so this big Thatcher revolution was going towards an enterprising economy. What do we mean by an enterprising economy? We mean everybody had to become more entrepreneurial, imprenditoriale. This was the direction we were finding with technology, as we were becoming more technological, basically managing to overcome time and distance with communications technologies. Many years ago it took so long to communicate, and it was very expensive. Maybe write a letter, it takes a long time to arrive, etc. Now, with the video conference, you can do it for nothing very easily. You can talk and act as if they're here. So this kind of revolution of technology, globalization because of technology and the ability to communicate and collaborate, really means that things could be done in such a different way, and people were empowered. People could get information that only top executives could have many years ago, and they could communicate to so many people. When I was young, to communicate to 300 people, you had to be a big boss. You couldn't write a letter to 300 people. They wouldn't take any notice. Now you can write an email very easily to millions, and do a lesson to millions, So it really meant that one person could have the access to information, could do research, could communicate to many people, etc. It really empowered, and that meant that by making people more entrepreneurial, they could find opportunities and become maybe create some sort of change, some sort of big impact. A small person now can have a huge impact using simple technological resources. So this was this enterprise economy where everybody was looking around and trying to make a big impact and thinking in terms of, being a business, thinking about their costs and their profit, how they're going to sell whatever they've got to offer. And so everything changed. School courses changed. It became very much more practical and much less theoretical. Technological colleges were empowered. Teachers were inspected and could be sacked if they're not good enough. Big organisation reduced workers to core competencies, so no longer did they do, everything from marketing to accountancy to computers. They just contracted out all those services, and they just stuck to their core competencies. So everybody seemed to be becoming self-employed and taking the risk and responsibility of the work they did. And suddenly universities had to compete, offering useful degrees and easier ways to get a good degree. So for example, becoming a lawyer one time took a decade. Then it became possible for someone with a degree to become a lawyer in 2 years. It became possible for a nurse to become a doctor in a few years. Suddenly they were making it easier to get ahead, and everyone was looking for opportunities to get ahead. Right, so Britain during this revolution also wanted to extend their market, their idea of a free market, to the European Union. And so we have the Thatcher pushing the European single market, the idea of a totally free market with profit and ownership of means of production and competition, etc. So here they needed to free up trade from bureaucracy and the barriers. We needed to reduce the barriers, get us all competing on the same level playing field, maybe accepting each other's standards, minimum standards, or even accepting each other's driving licenses and having the same indirect taxation, etc., etc. So I remember there used to be a ferry service from Dieppe in France to Newhaven in Britain, and you could go there and buy lots and lots of cigarettes and alcohol, but up to a limit to consume. After the single market, there was no limit. There was no possible governmental intervention on saying you can't import more than this many cigarettes. It was totally free, so there was no barriers, and it didn't chime. The free market in England and the social market in Europe didn't chime with each other, because the Europeans went more towards this idea of protection, this social market, where you've got protection for the consumer, the environment, the worker, limits to work, minimum wages, etc. In the Maastricht Treaty we had the social chapter, and Thatcher managed to get us an opt-out, so we could have a bit more of a free market rather than a social market. But later on, Tony Blair took that opt-out away, and said, no, we're going to have that social element to our market of intervention and protection and regulation. So in the end, we ended up with the same thing, a single free market, but with social protections. The British also really didn't like the idea of sharing sovereignty, having a common foreign policy, for example, went against our DNA. So that we had during this period the rise of Euroscepticism, and very, very slowly the resistance and criticism of European Union and their bureaucracy and their social regulations, etc. So during this time we can see both Thatcher taking advantage of the free market, but trying to keep out that idea of a social market, and also trying to separate us from the political integration that was also a big part of the European Union's project. Eventually, the British couldn't stand living under the same umbrella and having different values, so we didn't value solidarity and this social element, and so we did actually leave the single market even. So Mrs. Thatcher came out of power basically because of the poll tax. The poll tax was a tax where you pay because you exist, and the only way to avoid it was not to register, but then you couldn't vote. So we had lots of people not registering, and that was the way to avoid it. But that wasn't very democratic at all, because obviously millions of Labour voters which were poor didn't register, and so basically they sold their votes by allowing the Tories to be unassailable. So it wasn't very democratic at all. But saying that was the thing that brought her down, but there was a lot behind that too that brought her down, which was her anti-European positions. Half the party was very pro-European, and yet she was so firmly against this interdependence with Europe, this feeling of building a union with Europe. Remember, her whole philosophy was based on being against these unions and really allowing the individual to flower and express who they are, and the collective really just to take a back seat. So she was kind of against union of nations and believed in an independent nation state. That was the start of her unpopularity, this anti-Europeanism. Within her party, there was lots of speeches against her, and then came the poll tax, which really put the lid on it, really, because there was huge riots and people refusing to pay and going to prison because they couldn't pay. It actually became a possibility to go to prison, and eventually she fell. You can see up in the corner, on her way out, very tearful, and in the bottom corner we can see the fights and the riots between the police and the poll tax protesters. Now, right, so if we look at this revolution, this epochal revolution, this change, deep change in our economy brought about by Thatcher, and we try to compare it to the old, state model where the state were there to hold society together, to try to keep people stable, to try to provide the essentials for life, etc. We can get a sense that we've moved from a flexible economy to a gig economy. Let me just go into that. So the flexible economy was that, we could change so easily. It was so easy to hire and fire people and get people to be motivated to change the economy very well, very highly unpredictable economy where innovation can change everything. And a gig economy, I would say, is one where we really are just doing little projects. People are just working on little projects without much stability. Years ago, with the flexible economy, we were able to earn a lot of money, and that gave us security. But now it seems the people who are self-employed, and most of the people are self-employed now in England, it's rarely that you get people working for a big company, and if you are working for a big company, there's not many advantages in that anyway. It seems that these self-employed people have no union, they have no protection, they can't demand any terms and conditions. They just have to toe the line of those a little bit bigger than them and just do whatever they're told. And, just an example, if we look at Ken Loach's Sorry We Missed You, we see somebody who is trying to do a job as a van driver, a day's work, and he buys the van himself. He earns a bit of money, but he's really has to work all the hours. He's got no time for his family. He ends up having no holiday, basically in this gig economy, it seems the weakest workers can be really abused, and we've got this underclass because the state's so small anyway, and we've got this class of worker that can be really abused. So, has it worked out? I would say it seems that there's not much organisation for the best outcome for everybody. It's just become a big competition race to get to a safe place, and there's not enough safe places for everyone. So I would question, I think it is questionable now if we look back and have an analysis, have we just created a race to the bottom? That is, I think, the core of the problem. Is it a race to the bottom? Should the strong not help the weak a little bit more and hold us together as a group, as a community, in relationships? Or should we just pour everything into just survival and making ends meet, and those that can't make it kind of are left out, basically, of any success in the economy? So this is the analysis we need to think about. This whole project, the revolution, the Thatcher revolution, did come to Europe and did spread around the world. There was lots of privatizations. There were in Italy, it's the same, flexible contracts, trying to get more and more flexibility into the economy, smaller governments, and it hasn't touched Italy so profoundly, but other countries it has. But Europe is a little bit different. It still has this social market, this idea that there are minimums and protections for holidays and maximum hours to work and things like that. So there's still a slightly different model. But I think a lot of it has come to Europe of these ideas, of this low spending, low tax, low interventionist governments where the market forces really are let loose to produce the best outcome possible, and what's public is not valued much.